Good afternoon, and thank you for joining PwC and Workday's D&I webcast. My name is Diane Uden, and I am PwC's Global Workday Alliance leader. I'm personally very proud of the relationship that PwC and Workday have because it is a purpose-driven relationship around D&I. As we understand that diversity and inclusion is not just a nice-to-have anymore. It's an initiative that's an important part of the fabric of the business and talent strategies for organizations today. Beyond this webcast, we highlight the importance of diversity and inclusion through our joint initiatives, including the third annual Women in Business D&I panel at Workday Rising, which is Workday's largest user conference taking place in October in Orlando this year, and our city-to-city initiatives bringing Women in Business D&I panels to cities like New York City, Los Angeles, and Houston. So why is this an important conversation today? We look at companies, and they're all trying to make sure that their D&I efforts are driving the business forward in terms of brand, purpose, skills, talent, productivity, innovation, so many aspects that are driven by a D&I initiative. But how do they know if what they're doing is having the impact that they hope it has? And recently, PwC conducted a survey of global cross-industry businesses, D&I and HR leaders, to understand what programs their organizations have in place and the impact that they're having on the employee experience. And some of the key results coming out of that were that 74% of organizations state that they have a stated value or priority around D&I. Yet only 29% of those leaders feel that diversity is not a barrier to progression. So obviously still some room for improvement there. So for today, we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion as part of the future of work story. We're also going to look at people analytics broadly related to the diversity and inclusion agenda and the initiatives that companies have in place. We'll then focus on some pay equity conversations and then allow for some questions. So before I turn it over or introduce our panelists, I just want to highlight that we will be taking questions throughout the session, and at the end, we will answer as many as we can. So with you today, we have Denise Hemke, who is the VP of Analytics, Product Management, and Strategy at Workday. Scott Pollock, a partner in PwC's People Analytics practice. And Sushil Ahuja, a partner of our Workforce of the Future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sushil to kick us off.
Thank you, Diane. Good afternoon, everybody. So, as Diane mentioned, why is D&I important? So if you think about it, today this is diversity and inclusion is top of mind for the C-suite. And when we look at this, there are companies that are successful today with their D&I strategy. Those are the ones that are looking at D&I as a competitive advantage. So for some companies, it is a matter of social justice. For some, it's a matter of corporate social responsibility. Or to be completely candid, for some, it's a matter of compliance and making sure they don't get on the headlines of a newspaper for all the wrong reasons. But for others, it's essentially is part of their growth strategy. It's how you create value, how do you get the right talent in the door, how do you make sure you use D&I as a competitive advantage. And if you look at some of the statistics, it's telling us that when people are looking at prospective employers, where they want to work, D&I is top of their agenda. So there are different lenses in looking at D&I. So there's gender pay equity, which Scott and Denise will touch on as we go through the presentation. Retention is a big part. So I'll touch on a couple of key items, and just so that I can tee up these conversations as we go through this rest of the presentation. So from a retention perspective, it is an important part of your workforce strategy. So as you as leaders are looking at widening your net in terms of talent acquisition, like looking for the right talent, D&I is a key lever that you can use to win the war of talent. As we all know, it's extremely competitive out there in terms of getting the right talent, and D&I is a strategic lever that can be used. Now, our research has shown that prospective employers, when they're deciding where to work, they are looking at, or prospective candidates, when they're deciding on where to work, they are, one of the top things on their mind is looking at employers and the degree of D&I and the initiatives that that employer has in their organization. So it becomes a competitive issue. Now, once you do get the talent in the door, right, now the question becomes, how do I retain the diverse talent once I get them in the door? And this is where data and analytics come into play. So there are a lot of companies today, and I'm sure there's some on the phone here that you guys are representing, have moved the needle on predictive analytics when it comes to overall business, when it comes to HR. But I think the next stage is, how do you leverage predictive analytics and data for diverse talent and inclusion? So one topic is diversity, and how do you identify those inclusion issues and make sure that you are this tangible and measurable results, right? And you're looking at this in a proactive way. So from a PwC perspective, one of the things we do when we help our clients in this space is help build what we call a measurable or trackable leading indicators. So you can, to Diane's point, you can actually make sense of the data you have and actually do something about it, which is where the use of data and being able to mine the data and leveraging a human capital solution like Workday comes into play. So let me pivot from retention and dive into the business impact. So guys, we know D&I is important. You deal with it every day in your organization. We know it's the right thing to do. But I think we are at a point now as organizations where that's not enough. It's not enough to just say that it is the right thing to do and check the box because of compliance or training, but it is important and imperative to look at D&I and tie it to business impacts. The way to move the needle on D&I is to make sure that you're tying it to actual measurable business results, whether it comes from talent, whether it is new customers, whether it is products, new markets. And unless you do that, and it is hard, and we have gone through that ourselves, or actually going through it now, and in terms of a D&I journey, and it truly is a journey that I'm sure you are part of in your organization. There is no magic wand here, right? It takes time to change the fabric of a company, change the culture, but unless you tie it to business impacts and to the bottom line, it's hard to make those meaningful impacts with D&I. Now, how do you do that? So it's easier said than done. This is where data comes into play. This is where data that you can trust, data that you can mine, and that can help you to drive meaningful insights. And Workday gives you that opportunity. And we'll have Denise talk through some of the pieces that Workday can help do that. But this is a critical point where we are, guys, is, there's the importance of D&I. CEOs are talking about it. Organizations understand it. And we do have the data now that we can explore the art of the possible. We can create dashboards. We can create regression models and provide the data that is needed in the hands of the people that can do something about it. So, which is great, but that's not enough. So even if you provide the data, the big part of D&I, as you all probably see in your organization, is that it's hard to move the needle. And that's where the aspect of when you're looking to break or rethink your culture, your fabric of your company, how do you measure people, how do you get people in the door, how do you retain talent, the easiest thing to do is tie that to a major event that's happening. So, for example, if you're transforming your HR organization, if you're implementing or if you're transforming your HR using Workday, or if you're going through an M&A event, these are big events in your organization that people are expecting change already, and this is the time to cash in on that change. So let me give you a quick example before I move on. We actually were talking to a client not long ago that came to us and asked us a question that said, hey, when I look at my organization, I see that my women managers are more qualified when they are getting promoted than my men managers. And we are promoting less women. So he came to us and said, what's going on? Can you help us figure out what the issue is? So we went through the data, and we mined the data, came back with some results. And what the results told us was across the skills competency framework that the company was using, for instance, they had 5 key skills they were measuring, they found that the men that were getting promoted were meeting 3 of those 5 skills, and women had to meet 5 of those 5 skills to get promoted. So now, did this client not know this? I think inherently he had an idea of what's going on, but there was no proof. And now the data now gave him that data. The data gave him the results, and it was fact-based, and it was hard for him to accept, to be candid, but it was meaningful, and there was something that he could do about it. So I think that's the key now, is that there is data out there that can help us make these decisions and help move the needle. So now pivoting from the point around data, and we'll have Denise walk into talk through some of those pieces. When we think of pay equity, so I talked about different levels of D&I, right? We talked about retention, how it needs to tie with business impact. One of the things is gender pay equity. So from a gender pay equity perspective, it is a hot topic today in the market, right? And for all the right reasons. But what you see from a gender pay equity is there's a key in understanding the difference between pay equity and pay gap, and Scott will get into some of those details in terms of that understanding. But now, back to my point on data, this is another area where there is data out there now with the use of analytics, with the use of technology like Workday. There's meaningful impact that we can make and use that data to help drive the D&I agenda forward. So last thing before I transition to Denise is when we think about D&I, now we know that, hey, when we look at gender pay equity or fair pay, it is good for the bottom line, right? We need to tie it to the business impact. But the key here is there is a direct correlation, but the key is to make sure that the fair pay, it needs to be actionable, it needs to be measurable, and needs to be data-driven. So it needs to give the insights to the people who can make those decisions. And that's what, once we get into some of the follow-up slides here, guys, you'll see how we help our clients think through this and how Workday helps their clients think through this from a technology perspective and how we marry the data and the technology aspects together. So now with that said, with that data in mind, I think it's a good transition to Denise, who can walk us through how this can all be enabled through Workday. Denise?
Great. Thank you, Sushil. So here at Workday, we hear that many HR leaders want to be more data-driven. But in reality, many of them are still acting on instinct or their gut. And luckily, many HR business partners are really aspiring to be a lot more data-driven, which can really have a big impact on the business. The foundation of data literacy, though, is not just data, but it's putting the right analytics and insights into someone's hands, which often spans different sources of data so that those people can then act on it. Analytics is also not any one person's job. It spans many roles in the organization. Therefore, here at Workday, we've designed different analytical tools that serve the needs of these different personas. Everyone from the executive that is consuming the data and taking action to the person in IT that is integrating, preparing, and governing the data. The workforce reporting and analytics ecosystem of capabilities are designed to help you report and analyze, collaborate and present, and leverage machine learning to surface deeper insights to your users more rapidly. And across all of those capabilities, you have the option to combine Workday and external data with Workday Prism Analytics to provide users a view of the entire spectrum of your business operations. Now, going a level deeper, in Workday 30, we released the workforce composition dashboards to help support customers in their broader D&I strategy that Diane mentioned. These predefined dashboards are available to all Workday human capital management customers and are fast to enable and provide analyses to help you understand your workforce diversity, movement, distribution, structure, and performance. They are aimed at the HR business partner and the organizational leaders. These delivered dashboards help you get started with analytics and understand your workforce, like employee population trends by gender and ethnicity management level analysis. Now, customers can extend these insights they are already getting with their core HCM subscription using Workday Prism Analytics. We're now going to leverage Prism to analyze pay gaps, meaning ensuring that people are being paid equitably for the same work. So let's see it in action. All right. In this demo, I'm going to play the role of an analyst that supports our sales leader. As an analyst, I partner with her to get her all the critical insights that she needs to effectively manage her organization. Today, in particular, my leader is concerned with attrition and the factors that might drive attrition. So I'm logging in to take a look. Well, remember that I mentioned the out-of-the-box workforce composition dashboard just a moment ago? Well, here I'm logged into Workday, and I'm going to navigate to that dashboard. So as this loads, you'll see that by default, we're landing on the Diversity tab, where I can get a view of organizational diversity. However, I'm interested in looking into attrition. So let's navigate to the Performance and Potential tab. And as this loads, we're going to start to take a look at a couple of the worklets that we provide out of the box. The first one here on the rightmost is Performance by Hiring Source. And this allows me to see where my best hires are coming from so that I can really double down on the investment with those particular hiring sources. As we move to focus on the retention for high potential employees, this is using Workday's retention risk machine learning algorithm, and it is predicted that 25 high potential employees are at risk of leaving, and another 37 employees are at medium risk. And this is something that has our executive team concerned. So I'm going to navigate now to the Sales Organization tab, because remember, I've been asked to do this analysis for my sales leader. And this is a custom tab that I've created to extend the Workday delivered dashboard. And we're going to start with this rightmost visualization. Here, this is listing, using that same machine learning algorithm, the potential sales people that are flagged as either medium or high risk of leaving the organization. And you can see from the other two worklets that I've started to do some analysis regarding comp ratio of our sales organization. However, this comp ratio is based on external data that we've brought in via Prism Analytics and blended with data from Workday. We've purchased third-party salary survey data to look at salary ranges for each job profile down to the city level. Now, I've been asked by our sales leader to look into compensation as one of the factors for attrition risk, and to see if our high potential employees are within compensation range and are being paid equitably as compared to their peers. So in order to do this analysis, I'm going to navigate over to Drive. And as I land here in Drive, this is really my central location as an analyst to do my work. I come here to create workbooks and discovery boards. But we're going to navigate, luckily for you, to some analysis that I've already done. So we're going to jump into a discovery board where I started to do this analysis of attrition or retention risk. And I'm going to jump straight into edit mode. And you can see immediately that as our charts come up, they look really similar to that dashboard that we were just looking at. And that's because as an analyst, any insights I get from anything inside of discovery boards, I can export as a report, and I can put onto any dashboard for broad consumption across the entire Workday population. But let's focus on that sales organization in particular. So I've created a pivot table that's sorted by compensation percentile, and you can see that Jennifer Carter is one of our medium risk employees. And as I look at her compensation range, or her base compensation, and then compare that to the low, the midpoint, and the top range, which is that external data that I've brought in via Prism Analytics, I can start to see that it would take about $40,000 to get Jennifer close to the midpoint. But the real question is, should we give Jennifer this raise? So we're going to dig a little deeper to find out. So I've recently brought in some CRM data. So I could combine that, and combining that with salary and worker data, I can really start to make a quantitative assessment of the performance of my sales organization. So we're going to use this data to better understand the risk of Jennifer being paid below market. So first I'm going to start by bringing in my worker. And I could bring in other fields like is high potential, because we've been talking about these high potential employees. Now I want to bring in that compensation percentile, so how is she being compared to market? But now I want to zero in on really the people that are just booking revenue. So I'm going to apply a filter. And I'll just say more than $1, but I certainly hope my salespeople are booking more than $1 of revenue. And I'm going to bring in the sum of their total bookings into size, so that now the bubbles start to represent the total bookings of each of our sales team members. And I'm going to go ahead and sort this so that I can get a better understanding of the data. And now this starts to tell me a meaningful story. But let's take a minute to assess it together. So Brandon here is our highest performing sales employee, and he's done about $8.8 million in bookings. And the next highest bubble is Elin, who's done about $7.1 million in bookings. And then the next largest is Jennifer, and she's done just over $6 million in bookings. And it starts to tell a really interesting story. So now I've got this really strong case to adjust Jennifer's compensation by $40,000 to protect the $6 million in revenue that she's producing and to pay her equitably as compared to her peers. Now, since all of this is in the system of record, I can actually click here on this point and go straight to Jennifer's profile right here in Workday. I can jump to the compensation tab, and then I can move to the salary range analysis, where I've taken some of those same analytics that I've built using Workday Prism Analytics, and I've embedded this right in Jennifer's profile, secured, so that just her leadership team can see it. But I can go further than this. I can actually take action here. And this isn't something I would typically do as an analyst. It's something that Jennifer's boss, that sales leader, might do. But let me walk you through it quickly. Because all of this is in the system of record, I can go straight to compensation and request that compensation change for Jennifer. So I can say, I'd like to make a corrective adjustment to Jennifer's salary. And here, the next screen launches, you can see that yet again, we've embedded analytics using not just data from Workday, but external data as well, right into the business process, so that an organizational leader can simply take a look and say, here's Jennifer's current base salary, what is the mid-range, and what is the low and the high. And they could then complete the rest of this form requesting that compensation change for Jennifer. Well, I'll go ahead and let my sales leader take care of the rest of this business process. And let's go back to our original analysis. This has really got me wondering, is this pay gap gender related? So let's bring in our gender field. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to drop that into color. And now let's do another quick analysis of our top 3 performing employees. Here's Brandon, here's Elin, who is a female, and here's Jennifer. So you can see that 2 of the 3 of our top performing employees are females, and both of those females are being paid at or below market, which is significantly less than our top producing salesperson, Brandon, who's being paid significantly above market. So this is the first step of my analysis. I clearly need to do more research, but this pay gap is something that I can raise to my sales leader so that I can start to do this analysis for her organization, and we can start to do that analysis even more broadly. So now I'm going to jump back to the slides. And I want to talk about a customer that has done just this using Workday Prism Analytics. So Unum is a Fortune 500 insurance company and a market leader in group and individual disability, group life, and voluntary insurance in the United States and the UK, with over 9,000 employees. Using Prism Analytics, Unum has implemented pay gap analysis using a combination of data in Workday and external market data. This analysis in Workday enables Unum to focus on how to combine analytics and human expertise to give stakeholders actionable insights into pay gap, moving beyond just identifying the who and the what, to answer the question of why there are employees being paid above or below the average. By performing this analysis with Prism Analytics, the team at Unum can ensure that insights are accurate and timely, the process is fully automated, and most importantly, all of their analysis is using the Workday security model. So there is no risk of exposing sensitive employee data or limiting insights to just a small team in HR or a few executives. All of this means that these critical pay gap insights are getting into the hands of the HR partners and managers who can actually take action on them. Now, Scott's going to take you even deeper on understanding more about how to measure and evaluate the why behind pay gap analysis.
Great. Thank you, Denise. I think what we want to do now is really show you some additional analytic techniques that we can use to really dig into this issue of pay equity and pay gap. And the exciting part is the same sort of capability that Denise just shared to stay within the Workday environment, leverage Prism, and show results at both an aggregate and also an individual level can be done with the type of analyses that we're showing you today. And it's part of the reason that we're really excited about bringing these things together. So some additional types of analyses that we do, I think just to center on 2 sort of definitional issues. The first is pay equity and pay gap. And we've been using these terms as we've been going through the discussion, but it's important to understand that the pay equity analysis is really the legal requirement that we've got within the U.S. And so what that is asking for is really for an equal amount of work are we delivering an equal amount of pay? So this is a legal requirement. It takes into account a lot of factors and is a fairly, as we'll show in just a little bit, complicated analysis. Alternatively, what we've got is this analysis of pay gap, which really looks at if you take an average employee or median employee and you compare what that median employee is paid if it is a female versus the median pay for a male, or similarly, we could do this on other categories, we would see a difference in pay. And it's that type of pay gap reporting that is actually coming out of the UK and is a requirement in the UK. But we see it in many places. And it's really this pay gap analysis where we see sort of the 80 cents on the dollar that is sort of the understood number for what maybe females are paid as a percentage of men. And it doesn't fit into sort of this broader perspective of, well, how do we evaluate the level of work and the type of work that is done. So again, sort of in summary, right, equal pay for equal work, that's pay gap, or excuse me, that's pay equity. But really what we're starting to get at in pay gap is equal work. And are people doing the same amount of work or the same type of work? And so what generally accounts for these really large differences in pay gap that exist, that don't generally exist in pay equity, is that within the pay gap, you've got all these structural differences within your organization, all these differences, classically the situation where all of your leadership or a big percentage of your leadership is male and your administrative assistants, executive assistants, and other administrators tend to be female, right? And that's sort of a hyperbole for the sort of structural differences that may exist where, and Sushil's example early on sort of illuminated this, right? Where you've got more senior people that are male, more junior people that are female, and those are exacerbating the pay gap. Certainly we see this as well as we start to look at individuals coming into the organization. And so if we look at what pay gap might look like and what this analysis might look like, that's what we're trying to show on this slide. And so you see that we're tending to analyze a couple of different things. All of this data, by the way, is sample. This is not benchmark data. This is not an individual client data, but this is sort of sample and representative data that you might want to understand about yourselves. And certainly we do see sort of looking maybe at global versus US as we're showing here. But what you can see is looking at a couple of different pieces and breaking that out by gender. So we do want to look in the center, sort of starting at base salary and understanding that. But ultimately, we do want to get to total pay. And so including all of the components of pay, whether that's, bonuses, other variable comp, commissions, in Denise's example, et cetera, and understanding that total pay analysis. And we do find it really helpful to understand, the new hires, and are we closing our pay gap through our hiring processes, or are we, perpetuating the state we're in? And again, for most companies, as they bring in experienced hires, are finding that they're bringing in experienced men and fewer experienced women, or when they bring the women in, it's at a lower level, or, back to some of the more thornier issues or understanding who's negotiating their salary better, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of what pay gap analysis would look like. If I make a bit of a statement, as we've sort of within PwC measured D&I for years and years and thought about all the various sort of representation, movement, et cetera, type metrics, and sort of grappled with the question of how do you, if you had only one measure to measure the state of D&I, what would it be? Well, for my money, it's actually pay gap. if we really looked at pay gap, to me, it's sort of the single metric that would define the state of diversity and inclusion in your organization, not just from a pay standpoint, but certainly addressing sort of these structural issues, these movement issues, these turnover issues. And so for me, this is very much a D&I metric. But let's sort of use that as a foil to get into this deeper, this question of pay equity, right? Both a legal requirement and I think to what Sushil was talking about as we think about really driving the type of environment that we want to have, one of which pays fairly, one of which in which employees feel part and included, and that a culture is developed that you want. But really, to us, this is starting to look at some of the pay equity issues. And so as we think about pay equity, this is a predictive model. And essentially what we are doing is building a multivariate model that predicts what someone should be paid based on a number of factors, and then evaluates what they are actually paid versus what we predicted that they would be paid. So that's where sort of this advanced statistical modeling comes into play. Having all the data to do this is very nice when we're working with a Workday client who's got all of their information in one place. It makes creating that model and creating that analysis very simple. But what we're doing, as we show sort of on the left-hand side, is first evaluating what is equal work. And for us, that's really coming through, hopefully, your job architecture and your levels and your roles. And so, you know, hopefully when you went through and implemented Workday, you took the time to really make sure that we've got the right levels and roles and that our job architecture is clean, because that's going to be the first thing that we do and that we look at as part of a pay equity analysis. In fact, it's so important that because we're going to build a model for each one of these like jobs. We've actually, for a number of our clients, used pay equity almost to evaluate the job architecture, right? And so if we want to understand if your job architecture is any good, we'll use pay equity type modeling to understand how clean the job architecture is. We then look at a host of different variables that are helping us to create that predictive model. You can see both risk factors, so those that represent discriminatory, i.e. problematic issues like gender, ethnicity, and age. And then there's a host of non-discriminatory factors, so things like tenure, manager status, location, performance, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll pull all of this data together and we will build a predictive model that understands, as I said, someone's predicted pay relative to their annual salary, their predicted pay relative to bonuses, and then their predicted pay relative to total pay. And what we're going to want to understand is the degree to which we've got a really good model and the degree to which, you know, what is driving that predictive quality. When we build a pay equity model, what we're looking at is two things. The first of which is an analysis of that job family or that group to understand within that group or job family what are those variables, and do we have any of those discriminatory variables that are part of the issue? And so if we think about the sales example, do we have gender as a predictive value in total pay? And if so, the sales function is showing bias and could be liable and has, you know, broader issues. Secondly, the analysis that we want to look at is each individual. And so we would look on an individual by individual basis to determine who are the outliers relative to what we would expect. And those outliers, similar to the analysis that Denise was looking at, we might use the predictive value to create for us the analysis of who needs to be raised. We've actually yet to hear someone who's lowered someone's salary based on the predictive model being much lower than what they're actually paid. But we will have this individual by individual level analysis. And it's both that individual level and that group level data that we might pull back through Prism into Workday so that we can start taking action on it. So if you know, theoretically, that's all very interesting, Scott. What does this actually look like? So now you're getting statistical results. So this is the example of one of those models. Again, within an organization with, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of people, we would be creating individual models for each one of those job families in a given country. So you might have hundreds, dozens of these types of analyses to look at the individual groups to figure out what's the nature of the results of the statistical model. So how do we read this? The first thing that we want to look at is the R squared, which is at the very top. And in this example, we've got an R squared of 0.84. What that is saying is that the pieces that are in the model are explaining about 84% of the variability of an individual's pay. And so we consider that to be a very good model. Sort of the industry leading practice for determining whether you have a good model or not is 0.7. If you're in academia and looking at various thresholds, you might even go down to sort of 40% R squared results. So pretty high threshold. If you don't have really good R squareds, the results of the model are not statistically helpful. And so you would either need to rethink your job architecture, or you might start to think about other variables that we need to be including. In Denise's example, maybe we want to look at sales versus quota, or sales as a proxy for performance that we'd be pulling into a model for an individual group. But in this example, we've got a good model. That means those variables that we were looking at predicted the pay quite well. And what we can start to then look at is, well, okay, what are those items that are indeed predicting pay? And that's what we're showing in the box. And it's a little counterintuitive, but the lower the number here, the closer to zero. Actually, what we're getting at is, closer, which is actually 1. We're looking at what is the likelihood that this is random. And the lower the value, the lower the likelihood that this is a random result. And so we're really looking at those things where we have 0.05 or lower as being, we're 95% confident that this variable is indeed helping to predict pay. Sometimes we'll look at those things that are 0.9 or 90% confident that these predict pay. But if we're getting into certain things that are, 0.34 or 0.5, we're starting to get into a point that we think these are sort of random and not really important to the model. And so what you can see in this example is we've got several items of the job-specific predictors, the level, the years of experience, et cetera, time and role that are predictive and are predictive in value, and that's a good thing. But what you can also see is that we've got a red flag for this client, or this example, where gender is an issue. We have the red X under gender by tenure. And so that, to us, suggests that this company or this group in this company has gender as a basis for the way that they make pay decisions. Well, I shouldn't say make decisions, but the outcome of their pay decisions is correlated to gender and the time and role. So again, that's how we would start to read and look at the results of the pay equity model. The other thing that comes out of this often that's kind of interesting, if we look at this example, and this is real life for a lot of our clients, performance in this example, with 0.5 significance is not a predictor of pay, right? So we can use this to really understand, well, do we have broader performance issues, especially if our objective is to pay for performance? So again, that's an example and the detail of what we want out of pay equity. We might, for a client, and this would be, again, a report that we'd want to build through Prism into Workday, is to really start to give example, a job role, job family by job family view, a leader by leader view of where there are significant factors driving pay equity. And so again, you can see in this example, a whole set of models that had been built. And those green checks represent those things that are indeed predictive in value. You can see the summary of where performance is predictive in value. And in this case, again, an example, not that often. And you can also see those places where either gender or ethnicity are significant predictors of pay. And so this would sort of give you that summary level information of, well, what do I need to do? We have group detail as well. And so again, you can see at the top, we would start looking at some of the summary statistics. And this is where we've moved out of sort of group level and into the individual analyses. And so we could start to see the white versus non-white, or if instead we wanted to look at this on a gender basis, we could look at females versus males, start to understand the number of people, start to understand who are those that are high, who are those that are low, and then you should be able to, as Jennifer, or as Denise showed, do some of the double clicking to double click into who are those individuals and what do we want to do about this. So again, just some examples of what pay equity analysis we would like to do and how to do that. As we kind of come back to these multiple analyses of pay from a diversity standpoint, I think the commentary is, or the question might be, well, which one do I do? Do I start analyzing pay gap? Do I start analyzing pay equity? And I think our answer from a PwC perspective is, well, you need to do both. Pay equity will help you from a legal and a compliance standpoint. Certainly, I think the business starts to understand pay equity a little bit differently and maybe a little bit closer to home to say, hey, yeah, these are people who are doing equal amounts of work, and so they should be paid equally. But we also want to get into the pay gap analysis, really to start to understand, especially if you operate in the UK, but to start to understand, are there broader structural issues that we need to think about, either related to who's in what types of roles? Are there places where we just don't have representation to the degree that we should? Are we making our problems bigger or smaller as we think about this over time? And so ultimately, from our perspective, it's a need to do analysis of both. So with that, Diane, let me hand it back to you and you can go into the wrap-up.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And Denise, Scott, and Cecilia, what an amount of rich information for everybody. Hopefully we all came away learning something. I know I did. I think just kind of bringing it home, as you said, before we move into some questions, is that there are some lessons learned to pull from this. And let me just highlight a couple of these. First, I think it starts with leadership. This needs to have leadership engagement and alignment around it. And think about the leaders as your key audience and making sure that you're providing them with information that's meaningful to them. They're the ones who will be helping to make sure you're continuing to invest in this, and so you don't want to waste your valuable resources answering things that don't really matter to them. And I think the second part certainly is using a tool like Workday, obviously gives you access to a plethora of information, whether it's contained within Workday or, as Denise talked about, utilizing Prism to bring in external data to really get some business-related and rich information that you can use to drive your analysis. But the key there is that companies today require then the talent that can do that type of analysis, that analytical thinking, not only on the front end to pull the information, but also as you start thinking about the self-service capabilities and pushing information out to managers and employees, how do you make sure that they're upskilled to draw the right insight from it? So you have a great opportunity to think about some upskilling around the analytical talent as well as the insight, helping your end users be able to drive insight from the information that they get. Self-service being a key tenet for Workday itself, as you think about the changing way of work, and I think it really supports a lot of what's going on modernization of companies today. That changing way of work also creates the opportunity for the employees to help drive the quality of data that goes into the system. Because they're in the system, they're engaged with the system, it really does create some real credible data points for you. And then finally, I'm just going to highlight on community for Workday. That is a real unique and beneficial aspect for Workday itself. You can go out as users of Workday, go out to the community site, hearing what others are doing, sharing information and ideas, and being able to leverage that. So again, just some really great opportunities that sit in front of you as you start to think about your diversity and inclusion strategy. And I'll just leave it with this, is that this week actually marks the second anniversary of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. And this is a program that was started by PwC CEO Tim Ryan because we are so passionate about it. And he's been a real proponent in the marketplace, talking about how diversity and inclusion helps us drive business strategies, and has gotten over 700 other CEOs to contribute or sign up for the CEO Action. And what it really does deliver to those who sign up for it is an open exchange of ideas and actions and experiences, so that as you're thinking about how you move your diversity and inclusion program forward, it is a great tool and sharing of information. So with that, thank you to our presenters, and I'm going to turn it over now for some questions.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. One question here, this looks like something that Denise can answer. Is gender the only D&I field that can be used to analyze a gap? What about sexual orientation, transgender, or veteran?
Yeah, so I just gave the example of gender, but really any of the D&I fields that you are using to collect data within Workday, or if you're collecting data elsewhere, just like I mentioned, we brought in CRM data or salary benchmark data using Prism. You could also bring in external data, but I think all of that D&I data does typically live within Workday, and so yeah, the example I gave was simply using gender, but all of those fields are fields that are at your use for your analysis.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, this would be for Scott. When in my comp cycle should I be considering pay equity?
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting question. I think as we see companies moving into analysis and the analysis getting easier, we see it being done a couple of times. So historically, maybe it's done once and sort of done as you move into the planning or into the comp cycle. So on the front end, so you've got the data to start evaluating. What we do see clients doing after maybe a year or two of this type of analysis is to yes, do this on the front end of the planning process, but then to also do another pass at the pay equity analysis before any of the comp is frozen. Again, this sort of assumes that you're on an overnight approach to compensation. And so how do we evaluate the decisions that have been made both to merit increases as well as to any variable comp and evaluate whether that's created any problems. So we see that second one done pretty quickly before anything is finalized. And then lastly, we would see a pay equity analysis maybe done at the 6-month process just as a check. We also are starting to work with a number of clients who are trying to get the pay gap analysis out, sort of simpler to understand, and get that pay gap analysis out on a quarterly basis to their business leaders.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. And it looks like we might have time for one more question. Denise, I'll direct this one to you. Is Prism Analytics just focused on D&I, or can I use it for other use cases?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And really, Prism Analytics and here at Workday, we're focused on enriching the data that you have within Workday, right? The data about your most valuable assets, your financial data about how your business is performing and your people. So that might span a whole bunch of different use cases. We often see, people bringing in historical data about people because they might want to analyze mobility over time, and they have employees with long tenures, and so internal movement is important to them. We might bring in external survey data, could be employee engagement surveys, for example, to see how are individual employees' experiences and tie that to different other data sets that we store directly within Workday. Also, things like extended workforce. Sometimes you might have, especially in the world of a gig economy, you have people that kind of work for your company but may not be tracked within Workday, but we can present a global view. And then you saw me showcase a little bit of some of the operational data, like CRM data, where if your business has a call center, for example, bringing in call center data, because that allows you, to bring that data in as a level of detail below what you might get from your general ledger. Things like point of sale, for instance, if you want to combine that for financial use cases. And on the people side of the house, you can use that for quantitative evaluation, right? To say, hey, when I'm looking at somebody's employee review, or when that user is looking at their own profile, I showed you an embedded analytic on a user profile about their salary. That could be about how they're performing, right? How many safety events have they had this year? Or if they're in the call center, how quickly are they answering calls? How many calls are they taking a day? So that it's really clear what they're being measured on, and that and it's one aspect, right? It can't be just all quantitative. There's also a qualitative element to it, but it does bring a lot of transparency to that process. So great question.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think this concludes our webinar for today.